I see some people signing in, so we're going to wait just a couple of minutes to get started. All right, so good evening to everyone who's signed in already. I'm Tabitha Watchin, the Social Emotional Learning Facilitator for the East Providence School District. And I am delighted to introduce you this evening to Dr. Ellen Flannery Schroeder from URI, who's here with us tonight to talk about building your child's coping skills. So without further ado, Dr. Flannery Schroeder, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tabitha. I have to say I'm really excited about this topic, but I also want to sort of preface this talk with the following information. As you know, I'm a clinical psychologist and I occasionally work doing therapy with kids. I don't currently do that at the moment, but I have for many years. And when we are working in therapy with kids, we are teaching them coping skills over the course of 4 months. And so I'm going to present to you, I hope you've had your evening caffeine, which I'm sure many of you haven't, but I hope you're wide awake and attentive because we're going to do the crash course on building your child's coping skills. So ordinarily, we teach these skills across 4 or more months, but the good news is you have 4 or more years to build up these skills with your children. So I'll present the basics. Again, I love when people ask questions when they're relevant, so don't be afraid to ask questions in the chat. Tabitha will interrupt me, and it makes just for a more engaging and interactive talk. So without further ado, let's get started here. So just a reminder, this is the 3rd talk in a series of 4. So mark your calendars for March 2nd, avoiding the trap of overparenting in unprecedented times. That'll be coming up next. That's our final talk in the series. So you know that this is about coping skills. I want to open with what is coping? What are we setting out to do? We're building skills in what? So I've included a definition here for us. Coping is an adaptation to environmental stress. So we all know about environmental stress, and we need to be able to manage the stress of daily living. There are highs and there are lows that require us to navigate them. And that navigation or that management of things that life brings our way is what I'm calling coping. Do we cope with positive things? I think we do, but we definitely are coping with negative things. Usually coping refers to managing a difficult situation, but I think that we do need to use some coping skills, even in the best of situations as well. So coping helps us to control our behavior and our emotions. We know that we talk a lot of the times as if we don't have control over those things. When my kids were little and somebody hits somebody else, I'd be like, what happened? Well, he made me hit him and I'm like, well, he didn't make you hit him. You did that all on your own. But we talk, or she made me so angry. We talk as if other people have control of our emotions. But if we are a good coper, we have ways to manage our own behavior and emotion. So that's the overview. That's what we're going to talk about today: managing our emotions, behavior, and more. Coping contributes to a sense of well-being. So if you perceive yourself as a good coper or believe that you can cope in difficult situations, you can really sort of navigate the worst of times. Across the course of my life, in normal life, it's, thrown me some difficult situations. And I, in my adulthood, have come to recognize that life is going to bring me more challenges, that I have good confidence in my ability to cope. So do I fear those events as much? Definitely not. I don't want them to come to pass. But I know that if and when they do, I'll be able to manage it because of coping. So a lot of times when we're coping, sometimes we're doing it very consciously. We are doing it very intentionally and setting out, especially when we're beginning to learn those skills. So as you teach coping skills to your kids, they are probably going to have to be very intentional and conscious about it. But then, like everything else, it becomes pretty unconscious, so that we sort of fly through moderately difficult circumstances on a little bit of autopilot, navigating it with some coping skill, because it's a well-used strategy for us. In short, coping optimizes functioning, and that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to live a life with optimal functioning. And so why do kids need coping skills? And I would say because we want to enhance their overall functioning. We want kids to perform at optimum levels. We want them to be independent. We want them to be competent, confident. We want them to sort of have good mental health and wellness. And if we want that for them, one of the skills and tools that they'll need for sure is coping skills. Okay. All right. So I said we want to teach our kids coping skills because we want them to be functioning at an optimum level. But what is human functioning? What does that mean exactly? What are the ingredients? That's why I have those baking tools, because what are the ingredients that make up human functioning? Well, let's have a look. I like to think of the wholeness of human functioning as being comprised of 4 different components. And I think you'll recognize these components in your own life, and I'll walk you through them a little bit. So 4 components: emotional, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral. I'm going to argue that those 4 components kind of comprise one's ability to function. And so let's look at these 4 components, because I think these are the 4 areas that we really want to target when it comes to coping skills. So I'm going to talk about each one briefly, because we all, I think, are pretty good at distinguishing amongst these different components. So we'll start with emotional. So that's really comprised of mood, feelings, emotions. For me, those words all kind of mean the same thing. But I mean, it's happiness, it's sadness, it's anger. We've got this wide array of emotional responses to things that happen in the world. And that emotional response is what I'm talking about in this component. Physiological, I'm really talking about autonomic arousal here. So sometimes, let's say in the case of anxiety, this physiological component is really ramped up. So we'll see a lot of autonomic reactivity. We'll see the fight or flight. And in fight or flight, you might see shaking, a high heart rate. Other physiological signs for other mood states like depression, let's say, you might see low energy or slowness. By slowness, I mean like psychomotor retardation, where somebody is actually moving very slowly, walking very slowly. And then we have the cognitive component, which is made up of a whole host of things. By the way, I'm just listing a few things from these different categories or components. Cognitive, of course, is your thoughts. Other things that I'm going to sort of include in that cognitive component are concentration, which when it's problematic, it's a concentration difficulty. So I put it in the problematic here, but concentration, definitely a cognitive function. Decision-making, a cognitive function. Our belief system, which, when it's irrational, gets us in trouble. So I'm framing it here negatively in large part because we're going to apply those coping skills more often to difficult and problematic situations versus ones that are going quite well. And then last, our behavioral system or component, that's made up of the overt behaviors that we show. So impulsivity, tantruming, acting out. And now those are ones that are sort of externally focused, or they're excessive. But there are also some deficits sometimes in behavior as well that I'm capturing here with isolating. I mean, other times, so I think it's helpful to think of behavior as not just something that you do outwardly or do in excess, because sometimes behavior is a problem if you're not doing it and you should be. I'm going to stop there just for a second and see if there's any questions.
Nothing in the chat at this moment.
All right, so we'll keep going. So remember, I'm laying out these ingredients for optimal functioning, and now we're going to really look at them and target them for coping skills. Because if I back up a second here, people come in all shapes and sizes, and people and children vary across these four components in the difficulties they have within them. Some kids are more emotional and show a lot of behavior problems. Other kids might not show anything behaviorally, but everything's going on inside their head. And maybe they have a lot of autonomic, activity going on, like anxiety, but it's very internalized. So everybody looks a little bit different in how they are managing these different components. You might have problems in one and not in another. You could have problems across the board in all four of these components. I mean, we all have problems in these four components, within our lifetime. But some people, like my husband, I've told this story before. I'm not going to tell the story again, but I tend to react very quickly. I have high sort of autonomic or physiological reactivity. My husband, way laid back, does not. So there are individual differences in how we express these four components of functioning. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to talk about coping skills that are going to specifically target these four areas. So if you have a child who's got a lot of behavioral excesses, then maybe problem solving or activity, and I'll talk more about what those mean later, maybe they're going to be your go-to coping strategies. I'm going to say everybody really needs all of them across the board, but just keep in mind that some of these coping skills are going to be more relevant for some children versus other kids, and also they're going to be more relevant at some times and in some situations versus other situations. All right, so we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to start with emotion-focused coping. So we're going to be tackling emotion. Now, I apologize if anybody's a brain scientist in the room, because this is so incredibly basic, but I do like to do a little bit of education about the brain and what creates emotion, particularly big or problematic emotions. And when we have big or problematic emotions like anger or fear, the part of the brain that is very active and reacting is the amygdala. So you can see it there. I have it represented with a little bit of a fire, because that is that gets activated when we are feeling under stress or angry or some negative and big emotion. Now, I also have the frontal lobe at the front of the brain, and there's sort of a judge sitting there, a very rational, reasonable judge who makes very good decisions based on evidence. And the reason that I have the judge sitting there at the frontal lobe is because usually what happens, let's take a situation where you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off and you immediately explode with anger. Hopefully you don't, but hey, we've all done it. So you get really angry. That's your amygdala sort of, taking over, having a big reactive response. And then what we hope happens is that your frontal lobe takes over and controls that. So in my case, I might think to myself, gee, I wonder why that person is in such a hurry. Maybe they're trying to get to someone who's hurt, or they're rushing to the hospital, or there's a pregnant woman in the car. Who knows? But I'm going to try to make some explanation that's going to allow my frontal lobe some reasonable, explanation for the behavior that's going to turn off my amygdala and calm me down, and I'm going to feel less angry. I'm introducing you to the amygdala because your frontal lobe isn't the only way to sort of turn it off. I want to alert you to some really interesting research that suggests that just naming, so it's called affective labeling, putting a name on the emotion that you're feeling. So when you get cut off, you say to yourself, oh my gosh, I am so angry. And naming that emotion diminishes the response of the amygdala. Just the sheer fact that you have named what you're feeling. If you've heard me talk before, you've definitely heard me say that I believe that parents and caregivers really need to take some special time and make special efforts to train kids up in recognizing emotions, both in themselves and in other people. And here's just one more reason that it's super important for kids to be able to identify what they're feeling, because we know that if we want to tame the emotion, we can name the emotion. So I don't know if you've heard that before, name it to tame it. I think that's Dan Siegel. But anyway, super cute, easy to remember, wonderful, easy, quick strategy to get some control over that emotional response. So don't go with I'm fine. Don't try to brush it away. Teach your kids to really understand what it is that they're experiencing. And it's not easy for a child to label what they're feeling. You need to teach them the link between the physiological signs in their body and what emotion that connects to, so that they can correctly label the emotion. And then labeling it, of course, begins to turn off that amygdala response. So just more on what I was saying here, it is super important as parents and caregivers to find all of the different ways that you can to help kids be able to identify emotions. So you can do this any number of ways. I'll tell you what we do in therapy. It's super fun. We do feeling charades. So we just have a game of charades where we are role playing a particular emotion that the other person doesn't know, and they have to try to guess it. So if you can get your kids to play with you, and I think there's even a board game that you can purchase. I should have looked this up before this talk, but that is in line with this. But it's really, really revealing, because sometimes you see kids who are really good at recognizing the emotion that I'm portraying, but when it's their turn to portray an emotion, I can't guess it to save my life. Not because I can't read it, but because they are not good at enacting it. And so that always, it's interesting. It means something. Why are they there? It means they're sort of not monitoring their body well enough to be able to make that connection to what bodies do and how people feel. Super important connection. So you can play feeling charades, you can read books. I don't just mean books about emotions, but certainly you can do that as well. I just mean in the course of reading or watching a movie together, you could sort of comment on what people's bodies are doing that reveal how they are feeling, or talk about emotions, make it part of the conversation, whether you're reading about it in a book, watching it on TV, or whether you're experiencing it yourself. Sometimes I, would come in from a bad day at work and it'd be really clear. I'd be kind of stomping around and angry face, grumbling. And I can remember when my daughter was little, she once came up to me and, I don't know, asked me for some big ask, clearly not reading my cues. And so I used it as an opportunity to kind of, teach her about, read these cues about how I'm feeling, because maybe now isn't the best time to ask me that. All right, so we've covered sort of the emotional skill very, very quickly. Name it to tame it, recognize your emotions. Now I want to talk a little bit about calming the body. And, I want to spend a little time on deep breathing. It is very likely that you, maybe you practice deep breathing. I don't know, maybe you don't. You've been exposed to it. I'm not the first person to tell you to teach your kids how to do deep breathing. I'm going to guess I'm not. But I do really want to sell this skill because it's easy to do. It has so many benefits. So let me just sort of talk about some of the benefits. So as you know, it's sort of delivering oxygen. I mean, the whole process, I'm not going to read through this, but feel free to just take a moment as I'm talking and read through it. But the process of breathing is, going to end up with the blood carrying oxygen to your heart where it's pumped all around the body. But taking deep breaths does something else. If you're taking deep breaths, you're sending your brain the message that there's nothing dangerous or scary around. So I want you just to think for a moment about what happens in fight or flight, or what happens when you are confronting something that is stressful or difficult. The very first thing that your body does is it gears up for action. Gears up for fight or flight. So you start breathing quickly. That's only one of many, many things that your body does to really help you to fight well or flee well. I'm losing my train of thought here. All right, so deep breathing, fight or flight. I was headed somewhere. Let me just think about where I was going with that. Oh, I know. So when you slow down your breathing, you're sending your brain the message like, turn off fight or flight. We don't need it anymore. It's a really fast, effective way of shutting that down. So anytime you find yourself, or I'm talking about you as parents, but really, I mean, I'm trying to get you to talk this way to your kids. When your kids when you're finding that they're getting ramped up, what we want to do instead is take some deep breaths to send that message. There's nothing dangerous around, because if you are in danger, you are not slowing down your breathing. You're doing the opposite. So it shuts off fight or flight. The other thing that you can do, not related to deep breathing, but is chew some gum, because chewing gum simulates eating, and your brain says, what? There's eating going on. There's definitely nothing scary around. There's nothing dangerous or stressful around, because nobody eats in the middle of danger. So just another tip. I do want to take a moment here to watch this video. It's a super quick, really, I think, interesting for kids. I love to educate them about how the body works, because that education gives them a sense of understanding and control, which facilitates coping. So this video is super short, but we're just going to watch about how the air comes in and ends up sort of ending up with oxygenated blood.
When you breathe, air flows in through your mouth and nose and down your airways. Inside your lungs, the airways end in clusters of air-filled sacs. These air sacs are surrounded by tiny blood vessels. Here, oxygen from your lungs passes into your bloodstream to get to tissues throughout your body. Carbon dioxide is breathed out.
So super fast, super easy way of describing what happens. I want to concentrate for a moment on that last sentence, which is carbon dioxide is breathed out. Because one of the things that deep breathing does is it slows down your breathing and prevents you from breathing out too much carbon dioxide. When the balance between oxygen in and carbon dioxide out becomes off kilter, when we have more carbon dioxide out, that often is responsible for the feelings that we associate with panic. It often is one of the triggers for panic. So if you're breathing out more carbon dioxide, then you're taking in oxygen, and that delicate balance is offset or disrupted. You develop symptoms of difficulty breathing, tingling in your hands and feet, dizziness, all of those symptoms that we very commonly associate with panic attack. And then panic attacks can sort of develop into a problem when we monitor for those symptoms, identify them. Because we are not breathing deeply, we experience those symptoms, and then we overinterpret them or misinterpret them as being a sign of something super dangerous. So maybe we're just not breathing deeply enough. We then breathe out too much carbon dioxide, and then we begin to have some of these, tingling sensations or feelings of dizziness because of the disruption in that balance. And then we worry about what that means. Oh my gosh, something is happening, which creates more physical symptoms, which then, ultimately can escalate into a panic attack. More on that a little bit on the next slide, but I do want to just stop here and talk with you about how to take a deep breath, because you might think you know how to do deep breathing, and maybe you do, but maybe you don't. So I just want to, I want to sort of walk through this exercise with you as I would with your child. And I'm going to ask you to do it. So what I'd like for you to do is put your hands on your upper chest, and put one hand on your upper chest, one hand below on your stomach, or your above abdomen, above your abdomen. And then what I want you to do is take a deep breath in. And I want you to notice which hand is rising and which hand is not rising, which one's rising and falling and which one's not moving. Because for a proper deep breath, what we want to happen is for your lower hand, the one over your stomach, we want that to rise and fall. This is diaphragmatic breathing. So we want your diaphragm to push that lower hand up and down. And we want your upper hands on your upper chest to stay virtually still. You'll oftentimes see kids who have the opposite going on. So they take what I call a shallow breath. If you take a shallow breath, I'll try to demonstrate, but I don't know if you can see. What happens is your upper chest rises. And when we get anxious, that's the kind of breathing that we very sort of unconsciously go into, right? We've heard scared people do that. Doing that is not diaphragmatic breathing. It is exhaling that carbon dioxide and disrupting that balance, and it's getting us nowhere good very fast. So, sometimes with a younger child, I'll have them put a stuffed animal on their stomach and see if they can take in a deep breath and make that stuffed animal rise and fall with their breathing. And surprisingly, it is not as easy for kids as you would think it is. It's not as easy for adults as you would think it is. It does take a little bit of practice, but super, super important skill. So I already talked about this slide. So again, if you're breathing out too fast, too much, you're going to get a lot of those symptoms like dizziness, difficulty thinking, becoming short of breath. So deep breaths, wonderful. They shut off fight or flight, do away with potential panic, and they leave you feeling really great. It's one of my go-to strategies. You can do it anywhere at any time. I'm going to stop for a moment. I see that there maybe are some comments in the chat. Oh, great.
That was just me adding a few books that I love for picture books for identifying emotions, back a few slides. So
yeah, wonderful. All right, the SPOT series, I love that. That's terrific. All right, so moving on to progressive muscle relaxation. This is another super valuable skill. Some kids love it. Some kids just never take to it. So it's worth a try. But it involves progressive muscle relaxation involves tensing and releasing various muscle groups. So you tense a muscle group, like let's say you clench your fist, tensing your forearm, maybe even your bicep, and you're holding that muscle tight for maybe 3 or 4 seconds and then releasing it. And when you release it, the point is not that somehow the tension all leaves, although it does, but the point is that you want to teach yourself, and sometimes I say your brain, teach your brain to recognize the difference between a muscle that's tense and a muscle that's relaxed. Because how many of us sit around all day tensed? I can tell even as I'm sitting here that my back is tense. I'm going to try to purposely relax it because that's what progressive muscle relaxation is going to train me to do. So that when I detect a tense muscle, I can actively relax it in the moment. But the procedure is taking all major muscle groups, not at once, one at a time, tensing and releasing over and over again, concentrating on the feeling of the tense muscle and the feeling of the relaxed muscle, so that once this training is underway for some period of time, you can readily identify tension in your body and then actively release it. There are terrific progressive muscle relaxation videos on YouTube. They're all over the web. Find one that you and your kids like, or don't use a video and just you and your child go through it. There's some super fun scripts for young kids about pretending like you're a particular animal. So when you're stretching and tensing your shoulders, you're pretending that you're a cat, stretching, or you're using your toes to dig in a mud puddle. I mean, there's a lot of imagery associated with some of the relaxation scripts that can be a lot of fun. So I would encourage you to definitely give it a go with your child. The best time I think to do it is as you're laying down, make it part of that bedtime routine. Do it with your child to begin with until your child is able to independently do the progressive muscle relaxation. And again, it's something that they can do laying down at night, at bedtime. It's not a strategy that they're going to necessarily practice throughout the day. It's not useful as you're up in school and you're feeling, stressed before a test. You don't pull out your progressive muscle relaxation, toolkit and start doing it there. Though I will say that I have had kids who have told me that sometimes tensing and releasing their fists and their arm muscles in stressful situations has helped them to feel more relaxed, which certainly could be the case.
Ellen, I'm going to pause you.
Sure.
We do have a question about deep breathing. How do I convince them to deep breathe when they are against it as a task told?
Well, are they there? I need more information. Because I'd like to come up with some sort of clever way of inviting them into the activity without having them recognize that I'm telling them to do it. So if this is, an oppositional child, you might, I think what I would probably do is demonstrate the skill. So if it's a child who's going to reject it because it's something that I've suggested, I think I would probably just model the behavior. So if it was bedtime, I would, or actually anytime, I would do the deep breathing and then make some verbalizations about how it helped. Oh, I see. When they're upset, if I say, let's deep breathe, the response is, no, that never works. Okay, got it. Yeah, your child's not alone on that one. I think that what I would do is I would do the deep breathing, because what happens too, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, it's called mirroring, but when you are sitting with someone, we naturally, unconsciously mirror what they're doing. So one of the things I noticed with my own kids is the more sort of anxious or stressed out that they got, the more anxious or stressed that I got. But if I intentionally pretended I wasn't stressed and responded very calmly and slowly, and I took deep breaths, they would naturally follow that response. I didn't have to tell them to do it. Just the fact that they were with me and watching me, it would naturally happen. And I would say if you've never seen this phenomenon, the next time you're with someone, look at your poses and see, do you end up sitting the same way? Or do you have your hand, set on your face the same way that they do? We very frequently do that. It seems to be completely unconscious, and it definitely serves to facilitate a connection person to person, because when we see people who look like us and are sitting like us, again, not even in our awareness, but we like people better. So I think that is somehow that's by design. So I would say try that. And then the other thing about deep breathing is sometimes you can't use any of these skills while your child is upset, because they're just not, it's just not going to work. So find times when your child is maybe excited and positive, and use deep breathing then, or when your child's not upset at all. So it's not that they're in a euphoric mood. It's not that they're in a negative mood. They're just in a neutral mood. And that's when I would try to practice some of that deep breathing, as opposed to in the moment. Because yeah, it would help them tremendously in the moment, but oftentimes we get that a lot from kids, that they're not going to do it now. So practice it outside, and sell it there, and then hope that they will use it on their own. Okay. And model. If you want your kids to learn good coping skills, make sure that you're being a relatively good coper yourself. You certainly don't have to be perfect. I think there are very significant advantages to being an imperfect parent. Don't get me wrong. It is absolutely essential that as a parent, you make mistakes. But you do also want to you want to model good coping so your child can learn those skills as well. All right, so let's move on to focusing on self-talk. This, I personally think, of all of the coping skills, this is the one that I think has the potential to be the most helpful. It's not a comic because it's not particularly funny, but it is an illustration of how significantly we can hinder ourselves in our own head. And again, if you've heard me give talks before, you know I've said we need to talk to ourselves as if we are our own best friend, because some of the things we say to ourselves are just horrific, and we would never let anyone else say them to us. We would never say them to anyone else, but yet we do it to ourselves all the time. It's strange. All right, so if you can change your thoughts, you can change the world. I do believe that. All right, so you may be familiar with the cognitive behavioral triangle, but your child probably is not familiar with the cognitive behavioral triangle. I think that, in fact, this graphic and some of the upcoming graphics that I'm going to use, I took directly from the workbook that I created for working with children in cognitive behavioral therapy. So this past spring, I was on sabbatical, and I spent that entire time creating a cognitive behavioral workbook for kids. And so again, some of the graphics are going to come from that. So your kids don't really have a recognition that the way that they behave, the way that they think, and the way that they feel are all connected. But that's a really important lesson to know, because it gives us tremendous control. If you know that if I change one point on this triangle, I change the others. it gives me a great deal of a sense of control. So if I want to change the way I'm feeling about something, I can change the way that I'm thinking about it, and I can change the way that I'm behaving or the actions that I'm taking. And that is where the term cognitive behavioral comes from. So cognitive behavioral therapy strives to change affect or feelings by changing thoughts or cognitions and actions or behaviors. So that's where that cognitive behavioral term comes from. So the connection, super important for your kids to understand. And here's why it's important. So let's take a situation, and I want to illustrate through this situation how if we change our thought or making a change in our thought can take us to a completely different place. Everything changes if we're just willing to think about a situation a little bit differently. So first, we'll walk through the sort of anxious way of responding to the situation of a teacher calling on you in class. So the teacher calls on you, an anxious student would say, if I get this question wrong, people are going to think I'm stupid. Now, if I happen to think that thought, what do you think are my likely feelings? Certainly, I'll be nervous. And I'll be even embarrassed, even if I don't answer it. Even if I get it right, it doesn't even matter what I say. If I'm worried that I'm going to get it wrong and I'm going to look stupid, I'm feeling incredibly uncomfortable. And what might my actions be in this situation? Because these are all connected here. So my actions, very likely, I'm not raising my hand in class. So, or in this particular case, if the teacher calls on you, I might say, I don't know. Even if I have a particular idea, I'm not going to extend myself and risk embarrassment. Now, that's one sort of way these thoughts, feelings, and actions can come together. Or we can change the way we're thinking about the situation. So teacher calls on you in class, maybe instead I'm going to say, nobody's really paying any attention. Right? I mean, that happens all the time in classrooms. The child thinks everybody's paying attention to them, but actually in reality, everybody's kind of in their own head, daydreaming, looking out the window. And they may not be paying, full attention to what's happening within the class. So maybe I say nobody's really paying that much attention. And then how am I going to be feeling? Calm, not really alarmed because people aren't watching, and curious, right? Maybe I want to know, did I get that question right or wrong? That's a good question. I wonder what the answer is. And then my action is going to be that I'm going to take a guess because the stakes are low. Nobody's really paying attention. They're not going to laugh. I mean, we can use lots of different thoughts here. No one is paying attention is just only one of many that we would encourage as a coping thought. So I want you to recognize here what we have in yellow, anxious thoughts, what we have in green, coping thoughts. And we can switch up these thoughts even with the same situation. So teacher calls on you in class. You might think no one's paying much attention. You might think, I typically do well in this class, so it's very likely that I'll get the answer right. Or you might think, school's all about learning. I'm gonna take a chance. I'm gonna answer this question and see what happens. But this process of working through changing your thought and seeing the resulting change in the way that you feel and in the way that you behave is often a really important illustration for kids. So one of the problems, though, is how do we get to what's going on inside their head? Now, in therapy, sometimes we'll talk about what's in your thought bubble. I have a penny here on this slide because I can remember when my kids were little, just being so fascinated to learn what was going on in their heads. What were they thinking about? I was just so curious, like what was going on in there? And so I would urge you, ask that question. It has multiple benefits. It gets your child to make the connection between what they're thinking and how they're behaving. You get some insight into the way that they're looking at or thinking about the world. They have practice in verbalizing their inner experience. I mean, there's lots of good things that can come from that. So the penny is a penny for your thoughts. Let me know what you're what you're thinking about or what's in your thought bubble. What is in that thought bubble for people who are in stressful situations or anxious or depressed, people, let me start again. All people make thinking errors. You don't have to be anxious and you don't have to be depressed to make thinking errors. We all do it. It's automatic. I like to think of thinking errors as like weeds. You don't have to plant them, they just grow. But the coping thoughts that we really want to get to, those you have to plant. They take effort to get to them. So let me just step back and talk a little bit about some common thinking errors. Sometimes they're called cognitive distortions. There are about 15 to 17 really common cognitive distortions. I'm not covering them here just in the interest of time, but I would urge you take a look at them. If you've never read about cognitive distortions before, just Google that term. It's super fascinating because you'll find that you have fallen into many of those thinking traps for sure. But they're hard to teach to young kids. Depending on the age of your child, if your child's 7 or younger, they're not really good at reporting out on what they're thinking in their head. If they're 7 or older, the older they are, the better able they are to recognize what they're thinking in their head or how they're talking to themselves in their heads. So I wouldn't ordinarily go over those cognitive distortions with anyone younger than, I would say, 14, maybe a precocious 12-year-old. All right, so common thinking errors, we overestimate how likely it is that a bad thing's going to happen. Now you can tell that relates to anxiety. That is something that's very characteristic of anxiety. Overestimating how likely it is that I'm going to fail this test. So if I think for sure, I'm definitely going to fail the test, I'm going to feel pretty anxious. Or they overestimate how bad it would be if something happened. If I fail the test, I'm going to flunk out. That's it. I'm not going to college. When in fact, if they fail the test, it's one of many tests. If they just failed one, nothing, they can still go to college. They can go to a great college. So overestimating how bad it would be if something happens, again, leads to some dysphoric emotion, likely anxiety, but sometimes depression. And then internal, global, and stable attributions definitely has been linked to depression. So let me just talk you through what that means. If you make an internal attribution, so let's keep going with I failed the test. I failed the test because I'm dumb. That's an internal attribution. I didn't fail the test because the teacher made a poor test. That's an external attribution. I failed it because I'm stupid. And then I'm going to make a global attribution. I'm going to fail it all the time. Actually, the stable is supposed to be specific. So global, it's going to happen each and every time and everywhere. So it's not just that I'm failing in this math test, I'm just failing at life. That's a global attribution. And then stable, it doesn't matter how many tests you give me, I'm going to fail all of them. It's a stable thing. It happens that way each and every time. So people who think in that manner are at great risk for depression. And then many individuals, particularly kids and parents too, underestimate the ability of the child to cope. So that is a thinking error. I'm not even going to try to do something hard because I don't even believe I could handle it. I'm not going to put myself in that situation. I'm not going to run for class president. I'm not going to try out for the basketball team because I might not make it and I can't cope with that if I don't. Or I can't cope with the tryout because my skill level isn't good enough. So those are super common thinking errors. You want to look out for those in your kids. And then how do you teach your child to take those thoughts that they have that might be riddled with those cognitive distortions. So you might have anxious thoughts, you might have depressive thoughts, and how do you kind of convert them into coping thoughts? Because that's what we want to do. So kids don't naturally think in coping thoughts. You got to build them or plant them, like I was saying earlier. And so how do you get there? So you can ask these detective thinking questions. So let's say we have a child who's afraid of dogs. Let's say they have a fear of dogs and they're worried that the dog is going to jump on them and bite them. So what's the evidence that that actually might happen? Has it ever happened? How many times has it happened? So if we know the history of the dog, it's the dog of a family friend, and we know the dog's never bitten anyone, that's good data. And that data is going to allow a child to begin to adjust their thinking from anxious thinking to more coping thinking. Or maybe we have a child who's worried that their parent is going to be in a car accident on the way home. Do you know for sure that's going to happen? And how bad would it be if it really did happen? Now, car accidents are bad, but the most likely car accidents are fender benders in which there are, little to no injury at all. Or is there another explanation? So a friend walks past you and doesn't say hello, and you assume, or the child assumes, that it means the friend is mad at them. Is there another explanation? Did they maybe not see you, or were they preoccupied with something else? Can you perform an experiment to test your beliefs? So sometimes kids who have anxious or depressive thoughts will hold very firmly to them. And I don't want to be like, nope, you're wrong, because of course that is not going to work. So I say, you know what? You might be right. You might be right. How can we find out if you're right? And let's do a little experiment. So there was a time that my daughter, who's now 16, but this was years ago, when she would be really concerned with getting her hair perfect. And those of you who are parents of daughters probably know what I mean. If she pulled her hair back in a ponytail, there couldn't be what I heard another mom call a shark fin sticking out. The hair couldn't have a little bump on it. But one day she couldn't get her hair in a ponytail, and because she had these bumps and it was really awful. And I was taking her to the grocery store, and she wanted to stay in the car because somebody would see these bumps on her head. And I was like, look, we're going into the grocery store and we are going to look and see how many people actually look at your hair. And we're going to see if anybody notices or is likely to have noticed the bumps in your hair. And so, I made her go in. She really didn't want to, but I waited it out. I sat in that car until she knew we were not leaving that car till we went into the grocery store to do our little test. So finally she realized, I got to do this one. And we went into the grocery store. And of course, as you know, no one looked at her hair. And so, we can laugh about it now, but it was a very important lesson. She understood that there were some things that I felt firmly about, and she wasn't going to get out of them. But she also did learn that nobody looked at her hair. Okay, what would I tell a friend? Kids are remarkable in their ability to be helpful to their friends and to be accurate assessors of information when they're doing it for someone else. And we all do this, right? If I'm evaluating my own behavior, I'm going to do it much more critically than if I'm evaluating my best friend's behavior. Again, what would you tell a friend, and apply that advice to yourself? And then the final question here is this a feeling or a fact? So a lot of times people fall prey to believing that something is true because it feels that way. So if I feel afraid, the situation must be scary and dangerous. So is it a feeling, in which case it's not necessarily a dangerous situation, or is it a fact, in which case I'm in a dangerous situation and then I have every right to feel anxious? When you identify some faulty thinking with your child, walking through these questions can help take them from anxious or depressive thinking, or let's just say non-coping thinking, to coping thinking. I see that there is three comments in the chat. I don't know if I should stop and address those. I don't have the chat open.
They were just about if this recording was going to be available.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, this is one of my favorite comics. You can see this man here sitting on the bed, and I'll leave you alone with your thoughts. She said, how cruel. We don't have time to do some detective work on these particular questions, but you can kind of think about it in your own time or write one down and think about how would you generate some coping thoughts to replace these anxious and or depressive thoughts. You know, nothing ever goes right for me. How would you use detective thinking to sort of generate a new, more productive or helpful thought for your child? And if we end up with time at the end, but I don't think we will, because aren't we kind of at the end now? If I don't know, I'm happy to talk about this, or you can send me an email if you want. All right, moving on. So the goal of cognitive behavioral therapy is to create doubt where once there was certainty. So my goal is not to get a child to give up their anxious belief, but to have them say, you know what, I thought it was 100%, but now maybe I'm not, maybe I might, I still think I'm going to fail the math test, but maybe I won't. There's a chance. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a little fissure, at least at first. All right, moving on to problem-focused coping. So it's a great video. We'll just watch it. It's relatively brief. We don't have to watch the whole thing. Well,
what happened, Joey? Your head is stuck? Really? Hey, how'd you do that? What were you doing when you did that? Joey?
I'm just moving ahead a little bit in the interest of time. We don't want to watch Joey struggle too much. But Dad's getting in on the action now. Come on, Mr. Nebraska, you can do it. He tries with his hands. He's gonna try to get the butter. Eventually, there's a little leg action. I think that's coming now.
Oh, baby.
Come on, Dad. You can do it.
Yeah.
It's a real problem.
Yeah. Just like bold. He's trying to do it like the movie.
Well, bud, we might have to do this.
No, let Mama help. Okay, how are you gonna get out? Hey, you got out!
Yeah, I got out.
All right. Love that video. All right. So Joey solves his own problem. So there's an important message here. Resist the urge to jump in and save the day when your child is experiencing a problem. I mean, we don't want Joey stuck there overnight or anything, but we do want to let Joey struggle a little bit. We want to give him the opportunity to figure things out. So what if straight away Dad was able to bend those bars and get Joey's head out? What would the learning be? What would the learning for Joey be? It would be, I'm dependent upon my parents to get me out of difficult situations. But Joey got out himself. So what's the lesson there? Yes, I struggled. I tried lots of different things to get out. And ultimately, I was rewarded by my persistence. And what's the message to Joey's parents? Let him struggle. This is a smart kid. He can figure things out. So I don't have to jump in and solve all of his problems. Super important lesson. There are steps to problem solving, which again, super, super helpful. You probably as adults, you might use these, maybe not in a formal way, but teaching your kids to use them in a formal way, super helpful. So just to review them, what is the problem? Kids often worry about something that hasn't even come to pass, which means the problem isn't even here yet. So first, define the problem. Then list potential solutions. I'm going to give an example in a minute. You evaluate all those. Well, one important thing, when you're listing the possible solutions, you're brainstorming. So you're listening terrible ideas and good ideas because you're putting down whatever comes into your mind, because a lousy idea might lead to a brilliant idea. And then you evaluate each one, choose the best ones, try it out, start over if needed. So here's my example. Some kids are anxious about fire drills. They don't know when it's going to happen, and it creates a lot of anxiety. This actually was a problem-solving session that came from a real client, a real child who was afraid of fire drills. So we brainstormed a bunch of ideas of things that she could do. As you can see, some are great and some are terrible. And then she crossed off the ones, we walked through them one at a time. She crossed off the ones that were not good. And she was left with a very good plan that she then used during the next unexpected fire drill. Now, related to that behavioral piece. So remember, we're in the behavioral component now. So we talked about problem solving, but sometimes behaviors themselves are super helpful at shifting mood. So actually doing things, behaving in a particular way. Now, for every child, what behavior or activity changes one's mood is different, but it is everyone's responsibility to know when I'm in a lousy mood, what can I do? And I need to know personally, we all need to know personally, what activities can I engage in to make myself feel a little bit better? So I know that if I'm in a lousy mood and I do something kind for someone else, that is a huge mood booster for me. I'm like a new woman. That's all I have to do. I have to be kind and do something for somebody else. It doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be expensive. I just have to do something for somebody else. And I'm feeling much better. We want to teach our kids that this is a really important strategy to use because we're in charge of our behavior and we're in charge of our mood. So come up with a list. I've got a couple of things listed here, but there's, thousands more activities that one could engage in that improve mood. There's lots of things you could do that are not great ideas. I think that actually that's coming up in a little bit too. Of note here, I put this on here because I didn't want to forget to say it. These mood shifters and these behaviors that you can do to change the way that you're feeling, to improve your mood, should be ones that the child can do independently, not ones that are dependent upon someone else, because then your child learns to be dependent on somebody else to feel good instead of being able to do that all on their own. Some unhelpful coping behaviors, probably didn't have to mention these, but I just thought that I would throw them out there because I wanted to recognize that coping takes different forms. We're all trying to cope with stressful situations. Some of us are using strategies that are not good, those listed here. And then, of course, earlier in this talk, we've covered ones that are much more productive. And so in closing, I realized midway through this talk that I probably should have reserved this slide for talk number 4. But anyway, here it is, and I might throw it in talk number 4 anyway, because it's such an important point. We really want to build our child's coping skills so that they are ready to handle whatever life puts before them. We don't want to instead walk in front of the child. This is actually a great segue to talk number 4. We don't want to walk in front of the child, smoothing their path and making sure that they don't encounter any barriers in life. It's very tempting. We want to do it as parents, but we should not do it. So prepare your child for the road, not the road for your child. Thank you. And I'm sorry I ran a little bit over.
That's okay. One comment, thank you for this talk and looking forward to talk number 4.
Great.
Any other questions or comments for Dr. Flannery Schroeder while we still have her? Go ahead and put them in the chat. And while we wait just a couple of minutes, thank you so much for this, Ellen. It was really great. I took tons of notes and certainly are utilizing some of the resources you talked about. So definitely feel good about that.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We love having you. So I don't see, oh, let's see. Thank you. Can someone send the books that were recommended? Are the first 2 chats recorded? So the first 2 chats are recorded and will be available on the EPSD YouTube channel, EPSD Broadcasting YouTube channel. One of them is up there right now, and we just need to do a little tech work to fix the other 2 that are up there but not currently visible. So you will be able to access them on the YouTube channel. Nancy says, thank you. My son overheard you talking about the negative self-talk we use with ourselves. It is so true, unfortunately, at all ages. For sure.
Yeah, for sure. Is it okay for me to stop sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. The books that I mentioned in the chat, I'm not sure what you mean by send them. Did you want me to retype them, Sarah, the titles? Yes, I can't see that. Okay. So the first one was The Color Monster. And these are all picture books. And then The Way I Feel. And the next one is I think I originally typed the Spot series, but it's really the Little Spot series. And this is a series of books that focuses on individual emotions. So there's a book on anxiety, a book on happiness, a book on love, a book on sadness, a book on anger, and they all come as a part of a series. It's a really, really great set. And those were just a few that come to mind, but certainly feel free to reach out if you want more recommendations. Any other questions? Thoughts to share? My son is a self-talker and too quiet. He hides everything.
Yeah. Pull out the what's in your thought bubble multiple times a day. You know, I know, depending on what age he is, I know of a psychologist who uses a crown, and he has the child wear a crown, and then they write on a piece of paper and place inside the crown what they're thinking. I mean, I would say you got to get creative and ask the child, because sometimes kids don't want to reveal their thoughts because they can't access them. And sometimes kids don't want to do it because they're unwilling or they're embarrassed. So it's kind of important to know, when kids aren't sort of vocalizing about that, we kind of want to know. So he's 18, so he's old enough. Yeah, I would say treatment with a good provider. Honestly, therapy is way in vogue now. I never thought that I'd see the day. The problem is that it is so, well, I shouldn't say in vogue because that makes it sound like it's a positive thing, but I direct an anxiety clinic, and we are so overrun with clients. We can't accommodate everybody. But Maria, if you wanted to reach out to me via my email, I'd be happy to strategize and see if I could offer any help.
Can you put your email in the chat, do you think?
Yep.
just because we took the slides down. And then while you're doing that, Ellen, I am getting multiple requests for books. And so what I did was put a link in the chat to anyone who's interested. This is a resource that we're using here in East Providence called the SEL bookshelves. And the books that I mentioned are in there, as well as so many more related to social and emotional skills. And so if you click on the picture of each of the books, it'll take you to a video read aloud of that book. So if you don't have access to the hard copy, you can just open this link and access the video read aloud to use with your children if you're interested. So feel free to use that resource if it's useful to you. I am not seeing the links. Let me try again. Ellen, do you see the link that I just posted? Oh, weird.
Yes, it just came up.
Okay.
It came up. I
So
see though, I think that it's not going to everyone because it's just going to the host and the panelists.
Oh.
In fact, can people see my email that I sent out? Because maybe that is having the same problem.
Sorry about that. I just fixed it. I didn't realize that we were set to host and panelists. Totally.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay,
Leslie, are you able to see? All right, there it is.
Okay.
Sorry about that, everyone. That was
I'll send out my email again. Yeah. Okay, I think everybody should be able to see that now.
Perfect. All right, any other questions or thoughts before we wrap up for the evening? All right, well, thanks, Ellen.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much for being with us
Tabitha.
again. We really enjoy having you, so really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
You got it.
All righty, bye.